Hello and welcome to the AP World History Podcast. This is episode 10, The Rise of Islam. So most of the religions that we've looked at so far emerged in cultural heartland of major civilizations. Taoism and Confucianism in China, Buddhism and Hinduism in India, Greek philosophy in the Mediterranean world, and Zoroastrianism in Persia. Today, the world's two most popular religions are Christianity and Islam. And neither Christianity nor Islam emerged in cultural heartland of these great civilizations, but instead on the fringes of civilization. Christianity emerged in the Middle East in a remote province of the Roman Empire, and Islam emerged in the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula consists of about 1 million square miles of desert and hot plains sandwiched right between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. The original inhabitants of the peninsula are known as the Bedouin, and the Bedouin were nomads who herded sheep, camels, and goats. The political structure of the Bedouin were tribes based on blood relations, and each tribe would be led by a chief. And these various tribes were constantly locked in conflict with each other over natural resources, such as water. In terms of religion, the Bedouin recognized multiple gods, and each tribe prayed to a god that they thought favored their particular tribe. The Bedouin also had a rich tradition of oral poetry. Each tribe would have people who were designated specifically as poets, and the poets would tell stories every night around the campfire, and they would tell stories of their ancestors, about glorious victories that the tribe had won over other tribes in the past, of tragedies, of past defeats, and knowledge and tradition was passed through the poetry. So the people developed an excellent ear for listening to this particular type of poetry. So in terms of geography, the Arabian Peninsula is in a prime location to connect Africa, the Mediterranean world, and the Indian Ocean basin. So with the expansion of global trade, cities began to emerge that were based completely on trade. So the climate of the Arabian Peninsula couldn't exactly support a large self-sufficient population on its own, but cities were able to grow and prosper because of the wealth generated by trade. So this isn't different than the trading centers that emerged in Central Asia along the Silk Road, such as Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan. One of these cities that benefited from trade was Mecca, and Mecca's in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Around the year 500, Mecca experienced rapid population growth, and it wasn't just Arabs. There were Christian traders, Jewish traders, Zoroastrian traders, all in the mix. And a word for many different cultures and ethnicities in one city is cosmopolitan. So Mecca was a cosmopolitan city. So this new urban cosmopolitan lifestyle sort of challenged traditional values of the Bedouin. So we know the Bedouins were polytheistic, meaning they believed in multiple gods. They were also animist, and animism is the belief that life is produced by a spiritual force that is separate from matter. So this belief sometimes includes the belief that spirits and demons can inhabit physical objects, like wood, for example. So there's a superstition to knock on wood to avoid bad luck, so you're calling on the spirit that lives in the wood. Mecca was home to the holiest site in all of Arabia, and this site was known as the Kaaba. And it was an ancient stone building. The Kaaba was believed to be home to hundreds of regional gods, and it was full of idols. The Bedouin would make pilgrimages to Mecca to pray to their specific idol in the Kaaba. So, trade caravans made a point of stopping at Mecca to pray, even though Mecca was sort of out of the way of major trading routes. In the vicinity of the Kaaba, nomads had to relinquish their weapons for religious reasons. So even though the tribes were in a constant state of warfare with each other, the area around the Kaaba was sacred and people weren't allowed to fight there. So this served an economic function for the city of Mecca because it became a safe place to trade. Muhammad was born in Mecca around the year 570, and his parents sent him to live in the desert with relatives because they considered this to be a better way of growing up, and this was really the only way to instill the real Arab cultural values in a young person. Muhammad's parents died when he was young, but he was eventually adopted by his uncle, who was a well-to-do merchant in Meccan society. So his uncle employed Muhammad and taught him how to be a merchant. And when he was in his early 20s, Muhammad took a job with a wealthy widower named Khadija, and she was so impressed with his honesty and his skills as a merchant that she offered to marry Muhammad. So when Muhammad married Khadija, he was 25 and Khadija was 40, and Muhammad was essentially set for life because he married into wealth. So Muhammad started out life as an orphan, but was wealthy by the time he was 25. But Muhammad felt guilty about his money and became more and more concerned with what he saw as increasing social inequality in Mecca. Traditionally, the Bedouin culture stressed family and equality, and Muhammad saw this as being corrupted by commerce. So despite the fact that he was a merchant, he recognized that trade was creating social problems, and this prompted reflection. And like Buddha and Jesus, Muhammad was deeply concerned with social justice. And like Buddha and Jesus, Muhammad spent much of his time meditating. And Muhammad would do this in the desert mountains that surrounded Mecca. In the year 610, when Muhammad was 40 years old, during one of his meditation sessions in the mountains outside of Mecca, he heard a voice that told him to recite its words and warn the people of Mecca. At first, Muhammad believed that he was sick or going crazy, and he was reluctant to take on the position of a prophet, and he only told his wife Khadija and his closest friends about his revelations. But at the urging of his wife and his close friends, he eventually came to the conclusion that it was in fact God speaking to him. But it took Muhammad a long time to accept this. So for 3 years, he kept this pretty much private because he was a well-respected person in the community, and he did not want to be perceived as crazy. Muhammad's message was simple. There was only one God, and everyone was equal in his eyes. Muhammad believed that God had sent other prophets to earth before him. Moses in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament. Both of these spoke about the same God in the Torah and the Bible that Muhammad was speaking of and receiving messages from. But according to Muhammad, he was the final prophet. So the teachings of Moses and Jesus were earlier, less perfect versions of Islam. So because of this belief, Muslims viewed Christians and Jews as being partially enlightened and people of the book. They were much more enlightened than the polytheists who believed in multiple gods, for example. But on the other hand, there was friction with other people of the book, Christians and Jews, because they did not recognize Muhammad as a prophet. So Muhammad's message of egalitarianism, as you can imagine, wasn't well received by the merchant class in Mecca, who believed that economic inequalities were the natural condition, people were not equal, and we shouldn't pretend that they are. Moreover, Muhammad's message that there was only one God was a threat to Mecca and the wealth that was generated by trade. So Mecca was an important stop for trade caravans because it was home to the Kaaba. And merchants knew that if Islam was accepted, trade revenues would decline because people would be less inclined to come to Mecca and visit the Kaaba. So the merchants in Mecca persecuted Muhammad and the people who had come to follow him, who were known as the Muslims, or the people who submit to the will of God. The persecution of Muslims in Mecca didn't stop Muhammad from preaching, but rather inspired him to create a new Islamic state. In the year 622, Muhammad was able to escape a planned assassination in Mecca, and he traveled to another community that was more sympathetic to him, known as Yathrib. And to Yathrib, Muhammad was followed by some family members, some Meccan leaders who had decided to follow Muhammad, and a bunch of lower-class dependents, some slaves, and people from some poorer tribes. Yathrib was an agricultural community made up of mixed Arab and Jewish population, And the members of the community invited Muhammad not to come there and preach his message and convert them to Islam, but simply to act as an arbitrator in a conflict in the community. So Muhammad, during his time in Mecca, had built up a reputation of being an honest person, a person that was good at mediating conflicts. So he came to Yathrib for this purpose. So this migration to Yathrib, known as the Hijra, marks a turning point in the history of Islam, and it's the beginning of the Islamic calendar. So 622 is the first year in the Islamic calendar. In Yathrib, Muhammad created a brand new Islamic state called Medina. The Islamic community, known as the Ummah, that took shape in Medina was a type of super tribe. So instead of birth, membership was based on faith, belief in God, and this allowed for a more rapid expansion. All authority in Medina, both political and religious, was concentrated in the hands of Muhammad. And Muhammad banned charging interests on loans and implemented a mandatory payment to support the poor. The way of life, the way that the Muslims in Medina lived, is strived for as the ideal in Islam. So you'll hear about this concept of returning to the ideals of Muhammad in Medina. So Muhammad's faith-based tribe continued to grow in Medina, and you remember we're still in the context of constant tribal warfare, and Muhammad's followers were still involved in wars against other tribes. Muhammad's tribe grew in power, and they experienced a lot of military victories. And what happened often is that tribes that they conquered converted to Islam. It seemed to these tribes that maybe Muhammad was right and maybe God was favoring the Muslims. And not only that, but membership into the tribe of Muslims only required faith in their God. And Muhammad's followers eventually grew to a point where they could return to Mecca and conquer the city in the name of Islam. So when Muhammad returned to Mecca, the people were expecting either to be slaughtered or turned into slaves, but that didn't happen. Their lives were spared. What was destroyed were the idols of different gods in the Kaaba, and the Kaaba was claimed as a Muslim holy site, not because of the various gods that were believed to inhabit it, but because Muhammad and Muslims believed that it was built by Abraham, and Abraham was viewed as being the first prophet. So today, the Kaaba is the holiest site in all of Islam.